This is Astronomy FM.
Coming up next, an Astronomy.fm original program. It's time for York Universe, a co-production of the Observatory of York University, Toronto, and the Voice of Astronomy, AFM Radio.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to York Universe, the astronomy and astrophysics program written and presented by the students, faculty, alumni, not to mention the darn good friends at York University. I will be one of your two hosts this evening. My name is Paul Delaney, and I am joined from the farthest reaches of the planet by Satish.
Hi, everyone. Good morning for me and good evening for everybody.
He is up awfully early, folks, but you can't keep a good astronomer down. What can I say? We are broadcasting live from the Allan Carswell Observatory, located at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And tonight, it's Science Night in Canada, where the lineup is entirely Canadian, starting with ourselves, York Universe, on to Western World's Quirks and Quarks, not to mention Science for the People. York Universe, of course, broadcasts every Monday night at 9 p.m. local Toronto time. As, of course, Eastern Daylight Time, that's Tuesday morning, 1 a.m. Universal Coordinated Time. The York Universe production works in concert with our online public viewing program run by the Observatory team. Hi there, team. It runs, not surprisingly, between the hours of 9 and 10 o'clock, same as us, Eastern Standard Time. By all means, point your favorite web browser to observatory.info.yorku.ca and follow the links to online public viewing, OPV. Feel free to join the chat there and, of course, have a look at the wonderful images. Now, these are archival images. We're about to get a thunderstorm here. In fact, it looks like the world is trying to end outside at the moment. Hopefully, we don't lose connection. But at any rate, no live imaging tonight is the bottom line to it. Our broadcast is powered by and is in partnership with Astronomy.fm, the voice of astronomy. If you have any questions or comments about past shows, or you have comments for future suggestions, try that again. If you have suggestions for future topics, please send them along to observe@yorku.ca. You can always connect with us on Twitter or Instagram with the handle @York Observatory. Or at York U Observatory, not to mention on Facebook at Allan Carswell Obs. All of our programs are free, but if you would like to make a donation, by all means, visit our website, observatory.info.yorku.ca, and look for the big friendly button. We will be monitoring the chat room for questions, trying to post a little bit of content there, but as I said, no live imaging tonight, but lots of commentary from the Observatory team. So, Satish, long time no see, mate. How's the sky in your corner of the universe?
The sky is always amazing. Let me just leave it at that. It's beautiful.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Where you are, is there a lot of light pollution, or do you have to actually sort of move a few clicks before you get good dark skies?
I kind of keep the opinion that this is pretty good here. However, in terms of light pollution, that's where I live. I live outside the city, like way outside the city.
Very good.
However, people tell me that thank you. However, people still feel that the smogish, aura is still worse as opposed to other cities or other towns, which are in the interiors of the state that I am a part of. So it's difficult to compare when it comes to the local geography. However, as compared to Vancouver, for example, we have clear skies.
Aha. So. Yeah, well, Vancouver is known to rain from July 1st to June 30th. So anywhere just about can be an improvement over that.
Yes, and that's why I said the sky is always good, because you can almost always catch something beautiful in the night sky here.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Well, here's not a trick question, but off the top, you might know, what is your latitude there?
It is a trick question because I never remember the numbers, but I can Google and tell you. But that's probably...
I was just wondering whether you were as far north as Toronto or further south, more like, say, Southern California type latitudes.
Okay, so we are at 26.9 north.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so Southern
And
California type latitudes. Excellent,
yes,
excellent.
yes,
So you get to see good stuff in the southern sky as well as the northern. So excellent. Very nice.
unique position.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Okay, well, before we get too carried away with geography, let's turn our attention to this week in space and astronomy history, and we'll alternate, mate. So let me start off the evening with July 11th, 2021. This is very recent history. In fact, I actually had to read the date twice to make sure that, gosh, it was a year ago today that Virgin Galactic took flight. So we're talking about Richard Branson, we're talking about VSS Unity, we're talking about space tourism arguably coming of age. Now, of course, space tourism has been around for of order 20 or so years. We started flying space tourists to the International Space Station early in the 21st century. That was via Roscosmos and the Russian Space Federation and so on. They were taking individuals up to the International Space Station at sort of $20 or $30 million a pop, and the folks would hang around on the ISS for a week, 10 days, and then come back, all facilitated by the Soyuz spacecraft. And that program ran along quite merrily for a while. It was punctuated by the loss of the Columbia Shuttle there in 2003. But before and after the incident and the hiatus in shuttle flights, because of the loss of Columbia, before and after those dates, 2003, 2005, there were, I think, if memory serves, about 9 tourists who visited the International Space Station. And then they sort of stopped. Now, fast forward, and you will recall the X Prize. Actually, it wasn't fast forward. The X Prize was actually just before that. The X Prize was designed to try and stimulate more space tourism type options, because obviously one person a year or thereabouts is not what you call an industry. So the X Prize came and went, and basically it was Spaceship One that won that prize. And Virgin Galactic basically took that design and scaled it up to Spaceship Two with the intention of flying, like an aircraft, a cast of 6 passengers and a couple of pilots into an out-of-Earth orbit. They would sort of fly up in a plane under the fuselage of the White Knight aircraft, be dropped. They light the rocket engine and they rocket up to, of order 100 kilometers, and give everybody aboard a few minutes of weightlessness, and then the aircraft would come and land back at a runway out in the middle of the desert. So that was the plan. And everybody thought, particularly Branson, that this would all happen early in the 20-teens. Well, that didn't sort of happen. Space is hard, and scaling up Spaceship One to Spaceship Two was even harder. They lost VSS Enterprise in and around 2014, a pilot error while they were testing it, killed one of the pilots on board. That obviously slowed them down. Bottom line to it is it took until 2021, nearly 14 years after the X Prize, before Virgin Galactic took flight with 6 passengers on board, including Richard Branson himself and the 2 pilots. Interestingly enough, of course, they haven't flown since. So you can read into that whatever you like. There were some issues with the flight, although it did seem to go very, very well. The footage was quite remarkable and so on. But here we are a year later, and VSS Unity has yet to fly a second time, despite a long list of paying customers, as well as the Italian Space Agency. You might also recall that last July there was sort of the battle of the billionaires because a couple of days later, on July 20th, we had Jeff Bezos fly in his New Shepard rocket up to the edge of space, and he'll tell you with great pride that he flew about 10 kilometers higher than Branson, and they've dropped back to Earth now, I think 4 or maybe 5 flights. So they've continued the process of flying more and more passengers to the edge of space. These are all suborbital, of course. Certainly, I would argue that space tourism came of age July of last year, and because July 11th was Richard Branson and Virgin Galactic, they flew just before Blue Blue Origin and Jeff Bezos, you sort of got to bend towards the July 11th being the resurgence, if you will, of space tourism. We'll have to see how well all this goes. There are a number of other fledgling groups that are planning to fly to the edge of space. Big balloons, shall we say, flying to the edge of space, filled with hydrogen. I don't like that idea personally. But at any rate, space tourism really has come of age, and more people are flying into orbit, even if at the moment Virgin Galactic is not. But hopefully that will change very, very soon. At any rate, July 11th, 2021, the flight of VSS Unity with Richard Branson on Virgin Galactic. You remember last July?
I do remember last July, and I also remember everything that Jeff Bezos and who's the other guy?
Richard Branson.
Branson, yes. I'm just trying to be funny. Everything that they keep doing, and that's sometimes weird. So I'm trying to think of something wittier, which I can't think of. And while you were talking, I was looking at the VSS Unity's Wikipedia page. We do have something, or they do have something planned for this year, which is already halfway down the line. I think halfway done.
Yes, correct. Okay, but at least they've got a plan, so that's encouraging.
It is, but I just keep wondering when will that sort of percolate eventually to the masses? I'm not sure, although if that's a good hope to keep.
No, it will happen. It will happen. The analogy I always draw is back in the 1950s, the early 1950s, for somebody to go down to the airport and jump on a DC-3 or an equivalent airplane was a significant fraction of your yearly salary. Obviously, to fly for $450,000, because that's the suborbital cost at the moment, is a little bit more than most people's annual salary. But it's only a factor of sort of like 3 or 4 times, I think, what the mean salary for individuals are at the moment. Sort of, whereas back in the 50s, it took a long time before you and I had the opportunity to walk down to an airport, put money down, and jump on a plane. So the aeronautical industry and the aerospace industry, I think, have reasonable parallels. I would expect that space tourism, at least suborbital, will come down into the range of tens of thousands of dollars within 5 to 10 years. I cannot see them staying at the 400,000, 500,000 level for very long. Obviously, you're trying to amortize the R&D costs over as few a number of flights so that you can actually sort of turn a profit. But remember as well that this engineering is being designed not just for the tourist, but also to carry aloft instrumentations, payloads, if you will. The fact that space tourists are going to be in the equation is in many senses secondary. Both Blue Origin and Virgin Galactic are trying to create a niche market for the returnable payload. You put all of your equipment and your instrumentations in the vehicle. It goes up, it does its a few minutes of observations, and then it comes down again at the same place. It's very convenient in that regard. In contrast to rockets, where they launch up and you have to go chasing them hundreds of kilometers, maybe you have to fish them out of the ocean, and so on and so forth. So the industry is being designed around these reusable vehicles for payloads, not necessarily people. And that's what's going to help drive the cost down.
And so there's another way around, actually. Again, trying to be funny, but you could simply become an astronaut and then not worry about the cost, because then you'll become a pilot.
That's true. That is quite true. Yeah, very good. Unfortunately, yours truly is as blind as a bat. So the idea of getting astronaut wings any other way than Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin, it ain't going to happen to me, Satish.
We are in the AI age, sir, and I'm being told repeatedly by the internet that AI is the next electricity, so it shouldn't matter anymore. I'm just being extra hopeful, optimistic.
Very good. Well, hey, I'm looking forward to driving in a vehicle, a.k.a. the vehicle drives for me, but I'm sitting in the pilot seat, so to speak. I like the idea of self-driving vehicles that I can actually be in command of. Everybody get off the road. Okay, anyway. Right. So, Satish, grab one of your items and let's carry on, shall we?
Yeah, absolutely. So keeping space alive in this week in history section, we go back just a little bit in the same century to July 12th and July 14th simultaneously. The SCS missions, which I always get to pick up, and I never understand why. The SCS-104 was the specific mission wherein the Space Shuttle Atlantis flew to the ISS, or the International Space Station, nothing else. And it was with the intent to perform maintenance. That's what is one of the things that we get to read of. However, it also installed the Quest joint airlock, which, as it happens, is the primary airlock for the ISS. And it is the airlock which was attached to the starboard CBM, very simple acronym for Common Berthing Mechanism. I'm not sure why they use the word berthing there, of the Unity connecting module. So the CBM, of course, is the connecting mechanism, and then Unity connecting module is a connecting module, nothing more, which connects the USA and the USSR erstwhile modules, and then they sit and eat there. At least that's what Wikipedia says, but of course it serves a lot of purposes. So what basically was done between 12th and 14th of July 2001 was that this particular space mission flew the Quest airlock to the ISS, and then this enabled people to host spacewalks. And then there were two new types of suits, I think, which were introduced during this entire mission. There was the Extravehicular Mobility Unit, or the EMU, which is a two-piece spacesuit, and then there were the Orlan spacesuits, which is a Russian invention, so to say, which is a single-piece spacesuit. And these were used to perform maintenance spacewalks while they were up there. So happy birthday to the airlock.
It does get used a lot. I mean, rarely does a month go by without some sort of EVA through the Quest airlock. And as you say, there are Russian spacesuits, and then there are US spacesuits. Both continue to get utilized a lot. And even 20 years down the road, there's continuous maintenance happening. For one reason or other, there's either equipment which is failed and they go out and they replace it, or there's a little bit of recabling that is required. They've been continually adding modules from the get-go, and they added a Russian science module just about 3 months or so ago. So there is this need for astronauts to wander around outside. The Canadian the Canadarm3 and Dexter, the little robotic arm, or wrist actually, which is on the end of the arm, that does an awful lot from inside, but nonetheless, astronauts meandering around the outside of the space station, still a common sight on a month-to-month basis. So if you think back, 20 years worth of ISS history, probably on average, 6 EVAs per year, more on occasions, but let's just go with an average of 6. That means there has been in excess of 120, 130. Don't know what the number is, but it's in excess of 120 to 130 spacewalks. That's a lot of people wandering around space, and every one of them comes back and says it's the most magnificent feeling. Talk about a room with a view. It's quite amazing, quite amazing. And that part of it is I am very envious of. To think that you or I, Satish, could be, floating around in Earth orbit, falling around the center of the Earth, and looking down on that beautiful blue marble. That to me is very magical.
And I remain optimistic, sir. I wouldn't say any further.
Well, you're more likely. But speaking of spacewalks, there is a space tourism flight later this year with SpaceX, 4 individuals going up, and one of them will do the first private citizen spacewalk. So, spacewalks are, becoming part of the package associated with the flights into Earth orbit. They are considerably more expensive. We just finished speaking about space tourism. To fly into Earth orbit, that's like 20 to 30 million rather than 400 to 500,000. So a little more expensive. But as I say, part of the package now is spacewalks.
I just hope they'll bring us back to Earth.
I think that is highly likely. Certainly the stories that they always come back with, I think, are very inspiring. All of the space tourists, not to mention all of the astronauts, come back and they talk about the sights that they have seen. And you've got to believe that it is a very moving experience to see the world spin beneath you. You don't see the borders of countries outlined. You don't get the same fractured sense that you have here on the surface of the Earth. From orbit, it really is one world. If we could just get that feeling to spread around a little more, eh?
Exactly, and it's a beautiful feeling.
Tis indeed. Tis indeed. Okay, so the Quest airlock in place as of 2001. Let me take us back still further in time. This is actually a mildly sad moment, although not because we lost anybody, but the Skylab space station, the US's first foray into orbital habitats, launched back in 1973, very successful during 1973. That was the only year it was occupied. Finally deorbited in an uncontrolled fashion, tusk, on the 11th of July, 1979. Now, this caused a little bit of a furor at the time, and Satish, I dare say you don't remember too much about this, but when Skylab was predicted to deorbit, everybody was sort of in a little bit of a flap. The Space Shuttle system was supposed to go up and attach itself to Skylab and reboost it. Of course, it's in low Earth orbit, as is the International Space Station. And at those sorts of altitudes, there is a reasonable amount of friction with the Earth's atmosphere, especially when we go through solar maximum. The Earth's atmosphere expands. That increases the friction with low Earth orbiting satellites. And that, of course, slows them down. And if it slows them down, then they fall out of orbit. And once they fall out of orbit, they re-enter, and by and large, they disintegrate. By and large, though. The problem with Skylab is that it didn't have any onboard engines, and the expectation was that the Space Shuttle system would become available to boost it before it fell out of orbit. Well, that did not quite go according to plan. The first shuttle flight was 1981, April 12th to be exact, and as I just indicated before, Skylab came down on July 11th, 1979, close enough, 2 years prior. So, what was NASA doing about it? Basically nothing, because they couldn't. There was no way they could control the vehicle's re-entry. And so when asked when and where it was going to come down, they sort of said sometime in July and somewhere onto Earth. Yeah, not real good answers from NASA. This was not one of NASA's more shining moments. They've gotten much better at deorbiting things since, but nonetheless, Skylab was a little bit of a black mark. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Skylab fell out of orbit and managed to splatter itself across the outback of Western Australia. Yes, it came to land, and nobody was killed, although there are reports that a cow and a kangaroo were, and I'm not sure whether or not that's just urban legend or not. But the city of Perth, Western Australia, certainly got a wonderful view of the debris because it was at night. The debris, of course, very hot as it entered the Earth's atmosphere, and it literally streamed across Perth at altitude and came down 1,000 kilometres or so to the east of Perth in the outback of Western Australia. Yes, Australia billed NASA for the cleanup. Apparently it was a bit of a token amount, and there were a few thrill seekers out there who went and picked up pieces associated with Skylab to say they had a piece of memorabilia. So at any rate, point is, it wasn't a real good ending to the US's first effort at an orbiting space station. Skylab itself, though, was a terrifically successful mission. It was launched, as I said, in early 1973. The first Skylab mission to it was actually to salvage it. The launch of Skylab was very problematic. One of the solar panels was ripped off the side, and that took a piece of the heat shield with it as well. When Skylab made it to orbit, without that heat shield in place, the interior cabin was rising in temperature, and of course that's not good for electronics. And the other solar panel was undeployed. So the first mission went up and basically got the crowbar out and got the solar panel to deploy, and then they put a parasol over the area of the fuselage which had been ripped off during the launch, and that of course reflected away a lot of the sunlight, and that cooled the interior temperatures. That allowed for three missions, three crewed missions, Skylabs 2, 3, and 4 for 28, 56, and 84 days respectively. It really was the first time people had spent long periods of time in space. So it was an excellent precursor to missions like Mir with the Russian Space Federation and now the ISS. At any rate, as I said, July 11th, 1979, the demise of Skylab.
If I remember correctly, was that not the year that you either had moved to the Northern Hemisphere or you're about to move?
Well, that's very good. I had actually come up to Canada in September of 78. And it wasn't because I was afraid that they were going to dump it on my head or anything. No, it was completely independent of that reason. But you're quite right. I had been in Canada for the better part of 10 months when Skylab came down. But everybody in Australia was, I'm going to say, a little bit miffed with NASA. It made the front page of our newspapers for many, many days prior to the actual landing. So, yeah, as I said, not what I would have called one of the better efforts. Of course, later that year in 1979, a Russian satellite ended up in the Northwest Territories of Canada, and that was a nuclear-powered satellite. It was radioactively hot, so it wasn't a good year for things falling out of the sky onto land. You know, here we are, 30% of our area on this planet is land, which means you'd think that you'd dump most stuff in the ocean if you've got to do it randomly. But two high-profile events that year in July, and I think it was November of 1979, one in Australia and one in Canada. So, yeah, Satish, I rushed up here just to watch Cosmos satellite come down in the Northwest Territories.
It's repeat offenders, so they keep
yeah, I guess, something like that. Okay, what have you got for us, mate?
I have the most lucrative TWIH ever possible, talking about July 16th up until 24th in the year 1969 Apollo 11, the one mission that actually made it to somewhere for the first time. I'm not even being funny, I'm just trying a hand at it. So Apollo 11, it was the mission that took the first of us humans to the moon. The lunar module Eagle was what they were aboard. And Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, they stepped, well, actually it was first Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon after 6 hours of waiting once they landed on the surface of the moon on the 20th of July, 2017 hours UTC time or Universal Time. And then, the Tranquility Base is where they sort of stepped and talked and made some comments, which of course we all know about. Also, Michael Collins was the pilot who kept the command module Columbia in the lunar orbit, while the other two people were on the surface of the moon. And then this was 21 hours in total, approximately, before they lifted off back to join Columbia, and then they came back safely to Earth. And the reason I'm trying to cut it short is because there's way too much to talk about and way little knowledge that I have. So I think I can safely hand it over to you again, sir.
Well, I do remember it, needless to say. That was It was lunchtime in Australia when this all happened, and it was a grainy black and white TV that we were all squinting at as Armstrong set foot upon the moon. I still remember to this day that you could just about not make out Armstrong against the shadows because they were so dark. And as I say, the black and white TV's contrast was very poor. I can safely say that I have watched Armstrong descend the lunar module and step onto the moon many, many times, all far clearer than I did on that fateful day on July 20th, 1969. It really was a tough watch, I'm afraid, just because of the technology that was available to us. But nonetheless, you could hear them. I always get a good grin out of the fact that NASA thought that after they landed, this is Armstrong and Aldrin, that after they landed, they would go into a 6-hour sleep period. I mean, here these two guys are. They've just landed on the moon. The adrenaline is probably 50% by volume, their blood. And they're the first humans on the moon, and NASA wants them to go to bed. Needless to say, it didn't happen. And as you pointed out, they exited the lunar module several hours after landing because, of course, getting out of the module is non-trivial. It's a very small, cramped space, the Eagle. And by the time they went through all their various checklists, made sure that everything was up to snuff and getting the door open and the cabin evacuated, et cetera, was a bit of a chore. But nonetheless, Armstrong set foot upon the moon, Sea of Tranquility, and the rest, so they say, is history. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It really was sobering to watch the two astronauts around the surface of the moon. And again, the picture quality wasn't great, but there they were. The harshness of the moon, magnificent desolation was what Buzz Aldrin said as he set foot upon the moon. And that sums it up very, very well. It really is a foreign alien world that hopefully in a few years will become home to people. I mean, fast forward here 50 years and we haven't been back to the moon since Apollo 17. Hopefully Artemis 1 will fly later this summer or early this fall and pave the way for a return to the moon by 2025 or thereabouts. And if that does happen, NASA is committing to staying on the moon, building a settlement there and an international contingent of astronauts and scientists and so on. It would be a wonderful final legacy to Apollo, 50 years too late as far as I'm concerned. But nonetheless, if we do finally get it right now with Artemis, it will make what Armstrong, Aldrin, and their colleagues did with the 6 lunar landings just that much more memorable.
2 comments that I would like to make. So the first one is I feel incredibly stupid and surprised at the same time that it actually was the case that they wanted them to sleep. Like, really?
Yeah, that was the mission brief. That if you look at the timeline, they were supposed to go into a sleep cycle. Well, I mean, they'd been up for a long time. The argument was, and it's not an unreasonable argument, they'd been in lunar orbit, they separated, they went through a fairly harrowing descent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They had been awake for a long time. So it seemed fairly reasonable that they might be tired. But as I said, the adrenaline rush must have been enormous. And I can't imagine anybody saying, oh, yeah, there's the lunar surface outside. I'll just wait 6 hours and have a sleep. I just can't imagine it. And nor could Armstrong or Aldrin.
Was coffee legal by then? Or was coffee even about?
I honestly don't know whether or not they had coffee pills or whatever. They certainly didn't have microwaves on board. So, yeah, it could have been 10 days in space or 8 days in space without coffee. I'm actually not sure of that. I think in the command module they could generate coffee in a tube. It's just not the same as what we have down here, mate.
Okay, and the other incredibly stupid feeling that I have is that the news keeps telling us these days that this time we're planning to install a nuclear reactor on the surface of the moon. I'm hoping that the news is correct as far as the facts are concerned, but is it really the case? It is what I'm trying to wonder.
certainly the lunar habitats that are being promoted at the moment, I have not seen a nuclear power, a nuclear generator, nuclear power plant on the moon. My bet is that at some point it will be a reality, but at the moment, I think the plan is solar panels and a lot of batteries. I mean, the lunar night is 2 weeks long, of course, so you're going to charge up your lunar batteries and keep yourself operational for the 2 weeks of lunar night via battery power. And of course, you have the ability to crack oxygen and nitrogen and generate a little bit of fuel that way as well. Nuclear power, while it has, I think, tremendous potential in terms of you don't have to worry about the sun going below the horizon, I can't see us moving a nuclear power plant from the Earth to the moon anytime soon. I think trying to put the various elements on board any sort of a rocket at the moment and flying it to the moon is likely going to violate all sorts of FCC regulations.
Yes.
So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But it does make good sense because you can obviously generate a lot of power with a nuclear reactor, and the bigger your settlement becomes, the more power hungry they are going to be. And unless our battery technology improves dramatically in the next few years, and I hope it does, then storing enough power to maintain a facility on the moon during its 2 weeks of night could be a bit of a challenge.
Okay, well, I have nothing to say.
Well, as you say, July 16th is when Apollo 11 launched. July 24th is when it came back. Very important dates in history. Okay, well, let me just finish off one more This Week in Space and Astronomy history before we move on to other activities. And this takes us all the way back to 1975, and it holds the Apollo theme and also the Russia U.S. theme. It was on July 15th, 1975, that both the Russians and the Americans launched independently crewed vehicles into Earth orbit. This is the famed Apollo-Soyuz test flight, and it was the first time that Russian and American astronauts, cosmonauts, would share a common living space in Earth orbit. So these two vehicles, the Soyuz and the Apollo, would dock, and then literally the hatches would open, and the astronauts and cosmonauts would reach across, handshake, they would sort of drift from one vehicle to the other, and they continued with joint operations in orbit for about 2 days. The Apollo capsule, I think, was in orbit for well over a week. It did a little bit of extra science activity, but they were remaining docked for about 2 days. It's often referred to officially as the end of the space race. Space race, of course, was during the 1960s, where the Soviet Union, as it was then called, and the United States were vying for space supremacy, nominally, who can get to the moon first and put boots on the ground. That, as we've just said, was Apollo 11 and NASA, the United States, but it was all through the 60s that these two spacefaring nations really were going toe-to-toe. The Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, in 57. They launched the first creature into space, that was Laika the dog, also in 57. It was the first human in space, that was Gagarin. They had the first multi-crewed vehicle, that was Vostok. They had the first woman in space, that was Valentina Tereshkova. They had the first walk in space, that was Alexei Leonov, etc., etc. And it wasn't really until the Gemini program in 1966 that NASA drew level, arguably, in terms of space technology, and it was Wernher von Braun's Saturn V that was the icing on the cake, because the N2 rocket, which was the Russian equivalent, never made it off the ground for more than a few seconds. It was the Saturn V that took Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins to the moon in 1969. The space race began literally with the flight of Sputnik on October 4th, 57, and many historians claim, and I think rightly so, that July 15th, 1975 and the Soyuz Apollo mission buried the space race. You could argue that there are new space races that are forming, particularly with China, but we don't have time to chat about that tonight. So, at any rate, the Apollo-Soyuz mission of July 1975, the culmination of the space race, and arguably the forerunner to activities aboard the Mir space station and now the International Space Station.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, I guess so. Do you remember? I know you were alive for that mission, but do you remember reading about it in your history books?
You mean the Soyuz missions?
The Apollo-Soyuz flight.
The flight, well, not the history books, but sometime, somewhere, once.
Right.
You shouldn't count that as anything, please.
Fair enough. Folks, you're listening to York Universe, the weekly broadcast of astronomy and astrophysics out of the Allan I. Carswell Observatory, located in Toronto at York University. By all means, point your favorite web browser to observatory.info.yorku.ca. Join the OPV, the online public viewing team, as they show wonderful imagery from the 1 meter telescope, archival imagery because the skies are thickening here and we're going to have rain very shortly. This is the right time of the year for thunderstorms here in Toronto, I'm afraid. We've got other activities that you should be aware of. This coming Wednesday night is our Teletube Wednesday. That's 7:30 in the evening. And what we do there is the observatory team picks a topic, runs through some wonderful slide presentations, answers a few questions because this is on YouTube. And if the weather is clear, the 1 meter telescope is in action. Now, at this time of the year, unfortunately, the sun doesn't go down till around about 8:45, 8:30, 9:45. So we're still not in much of a position to show you things except the moon. And, of course, it is full moon tomorrow night. So the moon will probably be on deck on, Wednesday evening it won't be because it won't be rising until 8:45. So I guess we won't see it. But there's a full moon tomorrow night. That's just by way of passing. So the Teletube activity this coming Wednesday, 7:30. By all means, check out the observatory website because if you're in the Toronto area, we are back to several opportunities for in-person public viewing. The days of COVID and purely online public viewing are coming to an end slowly, but not every Wednesday night. So check the observatory.info.yorku.ca website to find out when the next in-person public viewing activity is running. Satish, next Monday night, big drum roll, 500 episodes of York Universe get celebrated.
And I'm still looking forward to that happening and everybody being on board. As a student, I can't even begin to explain the amount of enthusiasm I've had for this particular thing. And I'll save the rest for later on, of course.
You certainly have been a part of the host team now for a number of years. If you tallied up the number of episodes that you have participated in, it probably is getting close to 100, as silly as that sounds.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that's an achievement or anything else. Thanks for pointing out.
A lot of episodes, let's simply say that. But over the years, we've had some wonderful folks come online with us and participate. We've certainly had shindigs for the 100th and 200th and 300th episodes. Next Monday night, 500. Dr. Elena Hyde, the current director of the Allan I. Carswell Observatory, is backstopping it. And without sort of giving away too many secrets, the live presentation part of the show will be from the new domes at the observatory. We had 2 brand spankingly new, shiny, really shiny domes put in place on June 14th, and they are just wonderful. And so there will be part of the presentation next Monday night from within those domes. But a lot of our former hosts are coming back to join us in celebration. 500 years, give or take a bit, 500 episodes, give or take a bit, 12 years of presentation. So it will be a great show next week. So mark it on your calendar, everybody. Please do join us for our 500th episode of York Universe next Monday night. That is July 18th here, Toronto time, which, as we now know, of course, is July 19th Universal time.
And yeah, please do not forget.
No, that will be a good night. Yeah, hey, it'll be nice to see some of the other folks. I imagine that Ted will be joining us. The Sarahs will be joining us. I'm hoping that Kirsten from the U of T will be joining us. We've got to get Dr. John back and so on. So there are people who are scattered all around, but still keen into astronomy, if not still, being employed as astronomers. So yes, it will be a great night.
And I'm hoping all the first timers, not the first timers, sorry, but the people who were part of the first episodes, I hope they would be able to join, including Leanne.
Well, we've certainly reached out to her in that regard. We've been busily working our way through the entire list of people, as you can well imagine. Some of them are a little hard to track down, but I do fully expect that Ted Ruddick, who was one of in fact, he was the first person who actually broadcast on York Universe, and then he dragged me into it, which was really great. So Ted, who is now down in New Mexico at Sacramento Peak Observatory, will definitely be joining us. I just don't know whether or not it's live or is he going to be recording it. Astronomy in Action will be recording material. Jesse Rogerson. So, yeah, there's going to be lots of great names sprinkled throughout the evening. Well, speaking of big events, NASA had to upstage us. They had to do it before, okay? They released, late this afternoon, the first image, the first science image from the James Webb Space Telescope. It was done live from the White House sometime after 6 o'clock. It was supposed to be around about 5 o'clock local time, but it came out sometime after 6. We'll talk a little bit about that image in just a moment. But for everybody else, about 12 hours from now, so forget about what time zone you're in, 12 hours from now, NASA has the big party set to roll. And this is, of course, on their main website, nasa.gov. They've got their YouTube channel and so on. But 12 hours from now, you will see NASA basically putting on a show. This is where everybody who has been associated with the James Webb Telescope, and that's an awful lot of people over the last 20 years, a huge number of people, in fact, they will all be part of the presentation tomorrow morning. That's local time for the Kennedy Space Flight Center. The images that they have collected include images of nebulae, of galaxy and galaxy clusters, of a exoplanet. So there is something for everybody that is coming out tomorrow morning from the James Webb Space Telescope. Just a quick piece of history before we talk about the image, and Satish, I'll give you a moment while I'm chatting. If you pop over to the NASA website and have a look at the SMACS 0723 image so that you can come up to speed on it. But the history, of course, of the James Webb Space Telescope dates back over 20 years. We wanted to replace, wrong word, we wanted to succeed the Hubble Space Telescope with an even better instrument. The Hubble Space Telescope, I'm sure everybody will remember, was launched in April of 1990. It was astronomy's discovery machine, and it really lived up to that name, despite the fact that the very first images that came down showed that the quality of the imaging of the telescope wasn't quite up to snuff. It should have been diffraction limited, and it was not, because the mirror, as it works out, had spherical aberration ground into it, which was really disappointing. We finally solved that problem in 1993. We basically flew some spectacles up to the telescope and corrected the imaging, and every new instrument thereafter was calibrated to take out the spherical aberration. So basically Hubble did become diffraction limited, but it sort of took two shots at it. Nonetheless, even as Hubble was flying and making its spectacular imaging, everybody was saying, what's next? And the idea of the next great telescope in Earth orbit was really being thrown around in the early 1990s. It wasn't called the James Webb Space Telescope at that point in time, but nonetheless, the idea was fermenting, shall we say. They eventually settled on a design. They concluded that for science purposes, we really needed to be looking in the infrared wavelength. It's because the infrared, of course, is where a lot of the information from those early moments of the universe are coming. Because of the expansion of the universe, regular optical radiation is now being stretched, pushed into the longer wavelength radiation. And when you do the arithmetic, going back sort of 13.8 billion years, you want to optimize your James Webb telescope to look at light in the near infrared. And so that's why this telescope has got a huge platform that is basically a sun shield. It's about the size of a tennis court that blocks all sunlight from the telescope, meaning that the telescope and all of its components can settle in at about minus 225 degrees Celsius, which of course improves the sensitivity of the telescope. You don't have to use cryogenics or consumables to ensure that the telescope is kept at that temperature. You just have this sun shield. The telescope is at that temperature. There are 3 instruments on board. That's what they finally decided to build. And, of course, there is a fine guidance sensor there to help maintain the attitude control of this telescope. The Canadian Space Agency was instrumental in a lot of this activity. One of the 3 principal instruments, NIRISS, the near-infrared slitless spectrograph, along with the fine guidance sensor, was built by the Canadian Space Agency and contributed to the space mission. And as a result, Canada gets about 5% of the observing time on JWST. So all of this was fermenting in the 1990s. The original expectation was that this telescope would cost less than $1 billion and would be flown in 2007. We won't go through the laborious details of what happened, but here we are with a launch on Christmas Day, December 25, 2021. So that is, somewhere in the vicinity of 14 years behind the original schedule. And instead of sort of like 500 million, it cost 10 billion. That's a cost overrun. That's pretty amazing. But as Congress concluded in the mid-2010s, the James Webb Space Telescope was too big to fail. You just could not pull the plug, even though the cost overruns were significant. It launched. The next 2 to 3 weeks were the nail-biting 144 independent deployment mechanisms that would unfurl the 6.5-meter telescope into the 18 mirror segments and then the secondary. The deployment of that tennis court-sized heat shield, which was 5 distinct mylar layers, all of that went flawlessly. And then they went into commissioning mode. So for the next 5 months, they went into focusing mode and then instrument commissioning mode. All of that went seemingly flawlessly, and that brings us to today. And the first science image of a galaxy cluster called SMACS, S-M-A-C-S 0723. There are going to be a number of other images, though, that are a part of the shindig tomorrow morning with NASA. But from all that we can see, all of the engineering test data, and when you look at SMACS 0723, there seems little doubt that the $10 billion and the 20 years worth of effort has created an exquisite telescope. We are talking about not only diffraction limited, we are talking about something that is able to point back in time and deliver image quality, and I therefore would suggest to you science quality that is second to none anywhere on the planet. Satish, did you have a look at that image that they have released?
I have been looking at it for the past 10 minutes straight on, and if I do have a minute, I'll try and use it wisely. So, and I talk from the point of view of not even an amateur astronomer or anything for that matter, but just someone, as a human. And I'll try and take us back to, let's say, 30 years. This will sound a little childish, but when I was that young, and then we used to have those fairs or fates in our boarding school. And they used to do all sorts of decorations, glitter and everything. At that point, a child usually tries to connect that to whatever we actually can see in the sky when it comes to the stars. And there is a certain image that you carry in your mind. And I'm looking at this image, it takes me back to that memory. However, what I'm actually trying to say is the precision, the clarity, including I think what you and Rob were talking about, gravitational lensing being so visible and so accurately displayed in the image. I can't even begin to describe how mesmerizing this image is in terms of the achievement that we have made and snapped or clicked a picture out there in space with that much clarity.
Mesmerizing is a good word, actually. It really is. The depth of this image. I took some length of time just scanning around the image, and some of the small galaxies, they are showing their spiral structure. They are showing galactic jets. Very, very tiny. That entire field of view is only a small fraction of the area of the moon. The analogy that is being given is a grain of sand held out at arm's length. That's the apparent angular diameter. So it's of order probably only an arc minute or so. I actually haven't seen what the field of view is, but it must be of order an arc minute or two. And it is crowded with galaxies, all exquisitely focused, except the ones that are distorted by gravitational lensing. I mean, this is gravitational lensing to its finest. SMAC 0723 is the foreground cluster of galaxies. So the bigger galaxies that you can see, they're the brighter galaxies. They're in the foreground. And then, of course, the lensed galaxies. And as you pointed out, there are many, many light lenses, distortions in this image. All of it really, really sharp. So diffraction limited, we're talking a fraction of a second of arc worth of resolution. And that was a 12.5-hour image that was taken, roughly speaking. I'm not quite sure over how many days. It was taken in May, but it was 12, and it might have just been one for all I know. So 12.5 hours worth of imaging. It is deeper than an infrared image from the Hubble Space Telescope. And the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, of course, was a 4.5-day exposure. So this is 1/10 the time and deeper than Hubble. And that perhaps sums up the James Webb Space Telescope's capabilities. It's not meant to diminish Hubble's capabilities and what it has achieved, but rather it underscores what you can do with 30 years more technology underneath your belt. And that's what James Webb is delivering. And we've seen that now just with one image. Tomorrow we'll see it with many, many more.
And I guess just one more thing I'd add is that even to the untrained eye, the precision and then the idea of depth of the field of view it can give, like how far back it actually is looking at, that's probably what I'm trying to phrase when I said mesmerizing.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
I mean, some of those galaxies could be literally going back in time and being viewed as they were 13 billion years ago. We have to wait and be told more about this image, but the smallest, faintest galaxies there probably are 12, 13 billion years old. And of course, once Webb hits its stride, it should be able to do even better than that and get us back to 13.5, 13.6 billion years, back to those first moments in time when stars and galaxies were forming. Great potential this telescope has. I encourage everybody to tune in tomorrow morning, 12 hours roughly speaking, from right now to nasa.gov or the NASA YouTube channel. It'll be well worth the wait and certainly a moment in history to cherish. Folks, we've hit the top of the hour. You've been listening to York Universe, the weekly broadcast of astronomy and astrophysics out of the Allan Carswell Observatory here at York University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Shatish from the far side of the world, and myself, Paul, from just down the street from York University, have been keeping you company tonight. It is Science Night in Canada, so please stay tuned for the rest of the evening. Quirks and Quarks, Science for the People, and Western Worlds coming your way. And the 500th episode of York Universe next Monday night, July 18th. We'll see you all then. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
We hope that you've enjoyed this program from AFM Radio, the broadcast service of Astronomy.fm. This program has been released under Creative Commons license. Please contact us for details. You may find more of our AFM original programs on our